Welcome to your Geopolitical Updates channel. Leave your like and subscribe to the channel to help us grow. In today's program, we start with the news about the war in Ukraine. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky recently gave an interview to Italian media. In response to a question about the possibility of peace with Russia, Zelensky said that there is no hope for a diplomatic solution, as Russian President Vladimir Putin is a compulsive liar. Zelensky cited the case of the crash of Yevgeny Prigozhin's plane, a Putin ally, as an example of Putin's untrustworthiness. Prigozhin was the leader of the Wagner Group, a private paramilitary organization accused of war crimes in several countries. Prigozhin's plane mysteriously crashed in November 2022, allegedly after a technical failure. According to Zelensky, Putin ordered the plane to be shot down shortly after reaching an agreement with the Russian high command that said Prigozhin would only be exiled. This shows how it is impossible to have negotiations while Putin is in power, as he is not at all trustworthy. We also have the news that the United States is increasing military support for Ukraine. The country recently announced the provision of ATACMS long-range missile systems, which can reach targets up to 300 kilometers away. These systems could give Ukraine the ability to attack Russian targets within Russian territory, which could increase the risk of an escalation of the conflict. With this weaponry, Ukraine could make direct attacks on Moscow from within Ukrainian territory. The United States had previously said that it would not cede the ATACMS system to Ukraine to avoid an escalation of the violence of the war. Ukraine is about to receive several weapons that have helped it in the war, such as F-16 fighters and Abrams tanks. How will Putin react to more of this aid? Leave your opinion in the comments. The 18th G20 summit began today in New Delhi, India. The meeting takes place at a time of great global tension, with the war in Ukraine and the global economic crisis. The absence of Russia and China, two of the most important members of the G20, opens up space for countries from the global south, such as Brazil and India, to have more of a voice in the meeting. In his opening statement, Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi welcomed the entry of the African Union into the G20. He also highlighted the importance of climate finance and food security. Brazilian President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva also attended the meeting. He defended the commitment of developed countries to climate finance. Developed countries have pledged since 2009 to transfer $100 billion a year to help developing countries combat climate change. However, this commitment has not yet been met. Lula also criticized the excessive military spending of developed countries, which is around $2 trillion per year only on armaments. India also confirmed that other topics will be discussed at the summit, such as debt restructuring and sanctions against Russia. India, which holds the presidency of the G20 in 2023, hopes that the summit will be a moment of international cooperation to address global challenges. India, which is one of the world's largest food producers, also condemned the economic sanctions imposed on Russia, which could affect the supply of fertilizers and other agricultural products. Other topics that should be discussed at the summit include the global food crisis, the restructuring of the debt of developing countries, and the reform of the International Monetary Fund, IMF, and the World Bank. To date, developed countries have not had much of a voice in the summit discussions. India and Brazil are leading the discussions, and the G20 is becoming a space for the G7 countries to be held to account. Another important point is the letter signed by Brazil, Argentina, Indonesia, Mexico, and other countries criticizing the European Union. The EU approved legislation that prohibits the import of agricultural and livestock products from areas deforested after December 31, 2020. The signatories of the letter allege that the law is a form of economic protectionism by the EU, which seeks to protect its local producers from competitors from developing countries, such as Brazil. They also claim that the law is unfair, as it was passed after 2020, meaning that countries were not aware of the prohibition when they deforested their lands. In addition, the signatories question the effectiveness of the law, which is based on a product traceability system. They claim that the system is complex and expensive, and that it can lead to injustices, as some products that did not come from deforested areas may be prevented from entering the European market. It is clear that the EU is doing this to protect the local agricultural sector from foreign competition. The European Union has been adopting a series of protectionist measures, such as tariffs and trade barriers. These measures are justified as necessary to protect the environment or human rights, but in fact they aim to guarantee the security and employment of the primary sector in developed countries. The letter states that the EU law violates some principles of the World Trade Organization, WTO, such as the free movement of goods and the elimination of trade barriers. The signatories also state that the law harms negotiations for a free trade agreement between Mercosur and the EU. To finish the news, in the United States, Brazil is being talked about more and more, but not in a positive way. Republicans, in particular, have been criticizing Brazil, mainly for its rapprochement with countries like China, Russia, and Iran. It is important to remember that Republicans are in the midst of an electoral campaign, so these criticisms are part of the political game, an attempt to undermine the popularity of President Biden. In American politics, they do not only take into account internal aspects of the country, but also geopolitical relations. For example, the interference in the Korean, Russian, and Chinese issues. Senator Ted Cruz, a prominent Republican, spoke about Brazil again. Remember that, for the first time in history, a group of the American Congress demanded explanations from the Biden government about Brazil, in the beginning of the year. The Americans were concerned that Brazil had accepted Iranian ships in Brazilian ports, had made a 2-day visit to the United States without signing any agreements, and then made a 1-week visit to China, signing more than 30 agreements there. Geopolitically, Brazil is getting closer to the BRICS, which is natural. Ted Cruz criticized Brazil, saying that the country is associating itself with corrupt dictatorships, such as China, Iran, and Russia, and that this puts the American sovereignty at risk. He said that Brazil, as a South American leader, should think more about global commitment and that it should be held accountable by Biden for putting the sanctions imposed on Russia and Iran in the trash. It is important to remember that this is a very nationalistic stance of the United States. There are no good guys in geopolitics. But let's face it, China is indeed a dictatorship. Ted Cruz is right in his speech. But if Americans were so concerned about dictatorships, would they have relations with Turkey, Saudi Arabia, other monarchies in the Middle East, including military bases and geopolitical alliances? It looks like Americans don't like dictatorships that are against their agenda. But if it's in line with their agenda, they like it. Geopolitics is a world of hypocrisy. If you liked the video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel to help us grow. See you next time.